Hey, what is up? So for this video, I'm going to review the 8th episode of Season 5 of Better Call Saul, entitled Bagman. Like I said in my review for the previous episode of Better Call Saul, JMM, this is absolutely my favorite episode of the entire season. I'm not just saying that. So without any further delay, let's review this episode. Alright, so the cold opening scene of this episode picks up with a scene of what appears to be a cartel stash house of some kind. Again, in this scene, we can see all sorts of luxury cars, as well as other valuable items such as oriental rugs and some what appear to be expensive dresses and even some statues. We see two characters here cleaning a car which appears to have been in a hit of some kind. We see them cleaning the blood from this car and the windshield getting replaced. Not the most sanitary here, doing this without gloves. We see them kind of lightheartedly joking with one another. This is, of course, interrupted by what appears to be the boss or the person in charge of this safe house. Then, following a car entering this safe house, we see the mood completely change here. From the sort of upbeat music that was playing, it appears that someone maybe even turns this music off as soon as the cousins arrive in this car. Like I said, the mood completely shifts as it appears that everyone involved in this operation in the cartel knows that when the cousin shows up, this means business and the joking needs to stop. So anyway, we see the cousins enter this safe house and walk into the back, where we see a bunch of people counting money, what is presumed to be cartel money, of course. We then see them open up a lock, and in the back of this safe house, we see what appears to be, for lack of a better term, a cartel bank, because cartels can't use actual banks. And we, of course, see here millions of dollars that the cousins proceed to unload into these two duffel bags, which is, of course, implied to be absolutely the $7 million for Lalo's bail money. Following this, we see the cousins get in their car and drive away. This is then followed by a phone call from what appeared to be the person in charge of this safe house, where at the time he calls someone currently unknown to the audience and says to them that he has something for him if he's still interested, thus ending this cold opening scene. Now, at the time, and in this episode, it's not revealed to us who this man is or who he calls on the phone, but at the time, when I was watching this episode for the first time without the benefit of hindsight, I assumed that this would maybe be an inside job in the cartel to sort of steal this $7 million. Of course, the juice seemed to be worth the squeeze here when $7 million leaves the compound. You know, that's quite a lot of money here and definitely can cause some temptation. Of course, with the benefit of hindsight, it doesn't appear that this was correct. And of course, we learn the reasoning behind this phone call in the next episode, but I don't want to get ahead of myself here. Then, following this, Act 1, Scene 1 picks up at lockup, where we see Lalo Salamanca reading the newspaper and laughing to himself, reading about how the fire at Los Pollos Hermanos was ruled arson. Of course, Saul then asks Lalo what's so funny, Lalo then saying that he won't get it, not trying to divulge the sort of politics of the cartel and him working against Gus Fring. Again, it's a very long story that, of course, Jimmy doesn't need to know here. But anyway, following this, we see Lalo proceed to tell Saul, aka Jimmy, the directions to where he is supposed to meet the cousins to pick up the $7 million. We can hear Lalo state that he'll be out way in the boonies in the deserts, near the border to pick up this money, out of sight. Saul sort of even saying to him, why don't the cousins just drive the money all the way here, cut out the middleman? Lalo saying to Saul that if the cousins show up in town, his competitors will notice, and he wants to keep this on the DL, maybe even referring to Gus Fring here in the scene. Saul also pressing, Lalo saying, why doesn't Nacho Varga do it? And of course, despite Nacho gaining Lalo's trust, as Lalo says in the scene himself, $7 million, a guy like that could get real stupid real quick, insinuating that Saul is the guy for this. He's nobody. No one's going to look twice at Saul and think that he has $7 million in his car, according to Lalo. And he, of course, assumes that he's not going to run off with Lalo's money. Of course, then following some clear hesitation by Saul and Lalo seeing this on Saul's face, He goes as far as saying, maybe you're not the guy for this, I can find someone else. Then following Saul proceeding to get up and acting as though he's not going to do this, following a brief moment of introspection, he says to Lalo $100,000, sort of after a moment of thinking to himself, telling himself that this is the amount of money he would do this job for. This little drive through the desert, as Lalo said. Of course, following some back and forth here, they agree to the terms, and thus Saul is going to be the one who picks up this money at the border, thus ending the scene. Then following this, scene 2 of Act 1 then picks up at Jimmy and Kim's apartment, where we see Kim return home from work, and of course Jimmy is right there already showering, telling her he has an early morning. Then following some small talk banter here, Jimmy tells Kim that he has some business news to report. Kim then understanding what he's about to say, saying to him, so you're a friend of the cartel. Of course, Jimmy then telling her that he got Lalo bail. Kim, of course, saying that she knew he would. Then again, following some more small talk, it's revealed to Kim that one of the parameters of this bail is that Saul is going to pick up Lalo's bail money. This, of course, sends up immediate red flags in Kim's mind, going as far as telling Jimmy, if he understands what he's doing, picking up $7 million of cartel money at the border, telling Jimmy that she is not comfortable with this and does not want him to do this, going so far as to say, if it's safe, then I'm going to come with you. Saul, aka Jimmy, I keep confusing those two, saying that she can't, they're only expecting him, one person. Again, more pressing by Kim, saying, I don't want you to do this. No amount of money is worth this. You're a lawyer, not a bagman. Saul then tries to comfort Kim and reassure her it will be fine, going so far as to saying if he smells even the whiff of danger, he'll be out of there. Hugging Kim here in the scene, trying to emotionally console her. Then following this hug, after Jimmy saying that he'll be fine, we see Jimmy sort of contemplating. Again, we don't know what exactly is going on in his mind here. Maybe himself sort of wondering if he can truly guarantee this promise of everything being fine. Of course, he hopes everything is fine, but I guess some things are out of his control, of course. And then following this hug, this thus ends the first act of this episode. Then following this, Act 2, Scene 1 picks up with Jimmy at the location where he's supposed to be in order to meet the cousins to pick up Lalo's bail money. Of course, prior to the cousins arriving there, we see Jimmy sort of rehearsing his lines, yo soy abogado. Additionally, prior to the cousins showing up, we see a bit of foreshadowing here where following Saul taking a sip of his water bottle, we see him dump some of his water onto his loafers in order to clean dirt off of his shoes. Again, foreshadowing how in hindsight he maybe wishes he didn't waste that little bit of water that he does here in this scene. Anyway, following this, we then see the cousins proceed to drive up to Jimmy and meet him. Then again, following some very short small talk, very funny scene here. You got to go back and watch it. A lot of humor interjected here, despite how dark and tense this scene is here. I can't do it justice by describing it. So then following the cousins giving Saul the bail money, they then very unceremoniously proceed to drive away. Saul puts the money in his trunk, looks at it almost in disbelief of how much money he's currently in possession of, and then proceeds to drive back to Albuquerque as if nothing is wrong. Then following this, in a continuation of this scene, of course, very early into his drive back, we see him being ambushed by 3 vehicles here, again, displaying to us what that phone call was about in the cold opening scene of this episode. Again, it's not revealed to us who these men are or who that man was who called and who he was talking to, but nonetheless, following these men holding Saul at gunpoint here and forcing him to get out of the car, they proceed to take his keys from him and get the money from the trunk. Following what appears to be the lead henchman looking over the money, he then proceeds to give another one of his henchmen the kill sign to say to kill the lawyer. Of course, not wanting to leave any witnesses here. Standard operating procedure in this business. Of course, then following this, with Saul thinking he's about to die, trying to beg for his life here in any way he can, saying he's a amigo of the cartel. Of course, right before the henchman is about to pull the trigger and shoot Jimmy in the face, he is then shot through the neck by a sniper, thus proceeding this scene to enter a massive shootout scene. Again, definitely can't do it justice here, but we see a currently unknown, what appears to be sniper at this time, take out the entire team of men here who held Saul at gunpoint. Of course, with the exception of one who gets away in the end of the scene. But like I said, can't do the scene justice here, but we really see Saul Goodman, who has never really experienced violence to this level in his entire life, sort of try to hide here and not get shot. Anyway, like I said, following the death of all of the henchmen, with the exception of one who drives away, then as part of this scene, we see a pickup truck approach. Like I said, a man gets out of his car and gives one of the henchmen the coup de grace, who was still alive. And then we see this man walk up to Saul and ask him if he's okay, if he's hit. It's then revealed to us that this man who saved Saul Goodman's life here in the desert was none other than Mike Ehrmantraut. Then, following Mike looking over Saul and realizing that he's in a state of shock right now after experiencing what he just experienced, we then see Mike load the bags into Saul's car because his car is shot and all of the other cars are destroyed as well. And despite Saul's car being shot, it's the only one that's currently functioning. And thus, following Mike putting this money in this car, this thus ends Act 2 in this episode. Then, following this, Act 3 of this episode then picks up with Mike driving Saul back to Albuquerque in his car. Saul still in a state of shock here. Mike telling him that he's alive, he should focus on that and not worry about what just happened. Don't focus on that, focus on the now and the present. Of course, during this drive back, we see the car then stall out and cease to run. It's then revealed to us that Mike says to Saul that the alternator is shot, literally. So due to this, Mike then enacts the plan of taking Saul's license plate off his Suzuki Esteem, as well as the gas cap for his car, which reveals to us how Mike knew where Saul would be in the desert, and then proceeding to push his car into a ditch. Of course, prior to doing this, we see Saul tell Mike to wait, of course, trying to get the thermos that was given to him as a gift by Kim Wexler. Of course, it's revealed to us that this thermos has been shot. Again, definitely some symbolism here. That being said, in hindsight, what I thought this symbolism meant may not appear to be what the point of this scene was based on the trailer that we've seen of season 6 of Better Call Saul, but I don't want to jump ahead here. So anyway, following Jimmy retrieving this thermos, they then proceed to push the car into the ditch. And then Mike reveals to Saul that they're going to have to make their way on foot, of course, off of the main road because one of the henchmen escaped on that road. And if they walk up that road, they'd be walking right into him potentially. So they have to go off the beaten path. Saul carrying these 2 huge bags of money here, probably weighing over 150 pounds easily based on the amount of money, including the weight of the bags. We then proceed to see these 2 characters begin their walk into the desert. Then following some walking, we see them rest for a little bit because, of course, they're extremely tired and low on resources and water. Saul, of course, we can see him absolutely exhausted from carrying around these bags, going so far as to telling Mike maybe we should trade off. Mike, of course, giving him a look like you have to be crazy. Then Saul trying to enact a plan of maybe burying this money and retrieving it later. Mike saying that that's absolutely impossible. You'd never find it in the middle of the desert. The landscape looks exactly the same. You know, Saul in desperation mode here because, like I said, these bags probably weigh 155 pounds, if not more. Total combined, so about 75 pounds plus each. A ton of weight to be dragging around in the desert, in the sun, with very little water, no resources, not wearing proper shoes. But anyway, following this digging, this is then interrupted by Mike seeing the one henchman who got away doing a grid search because he says to Saul that they found his car. So again, they have to make way into the desert and get off the main road so this man doesn't see him. This then proceeds to display to us even more wandering in the desert, just trudging along. It's an unbelievable distance back to the main road, back to Albuquerque. Then following some more walking, we see that they proceed to make camp for the night. Saul asking them, why don't we walk in the night? It's much cooler at night. Mike telling him that if they go out there, one of them is going to likely break their leg in a prairie dog hole, of course, effectively killing them. We see Mike proceeding to try to collect water here in a survival mode. Again, I'm no scientist here or survivalist. I'm not really sure the science behind collecting water this way. But anyway, following Saul, checking to see if he has service, which he has none, which was foreshadowed earlier in this episode when he was driving back down the road to Albuquerque. The scene then proceeds to time lapse from day to night, where we see Mike and Saul camping out at night. Saul, of course, saying to Mike that his wife, of course, unbeknownst at the time to Mike, his wife is going to be worried sick, that he should have been home hours ago. Mike being very dismissive of this, saying that, oh, she'll think you're just out catting around. Saul saying, no, she won't. She'll think I'm out in the desert, chopped up and buried in some ditch. Mike sort of perplexed by why Saul said this, sort of saying, why is she going to think that? Of course, this then leads to Saul telling Mike that more or less Kim knows what he's doing. Mike then realizing that Kim is now in the game. Saul saying, no, she's not in the game. Sort of a interesting, very interesting conversation back and forth here. Again, definitely sort of in the big picture sort of foreshadows Kim's role in all of this and whether or not, as Mike said, she is in fact in the game, which will, of course, will likely be revealed to us in season 6 of Better Call Saul, not to get too much ahead here. Then anyway, following Mike and Saul proceeding to go to sleep for the night, we see Mike take out a survival thermal blanket, a space blanket, the exact same type of blanket that Saul's brother Chuck used as a result of his hypersensitivity to electricity, which in hindsight appeared to be much more mental illness than a physical ailment. But anyway, following Mike offering Saul one as well because it gets very cold at night in the desert, we see Saul reject it. Of course, a very symbolic thing for us to see here, where despite the fact that he will likely get cold, the sort of connection here and the reminder of Chuck and these space blankets makes him symbolically not want to use one in this scene. So yeah, very interesting act here. A lot of symbolism, a lot of foreshadowing, I believe, for characters like Saul and like Kim. But like I said, great act here in this episode. Then following this, Act 4 of this episode, Scene 1, then picks up with Kim Wexler at lockup, I think at MDC, where we see her waiting for none other than Lalo Salamanca. Of course, very interesting scene here, very tense. So anyway, following Lalo entering this room, of course, initially very confused here to who this person is. Then following them sitting down, we see Kim say to Lalo that she knows who he really is. She knows that he's Lalo Salamanca and not Jorge de Guzman, using this information to sort of almost extort Lalo into telling her where she sent Saul. Of course, amidst her speech to Lalo, Lalo says to her in a very angry manner, "Who the hell are you that he tells you my business?" Of course, Kim then reveals to Lalo that she's Saul's wife. Of course, stating that he didn't betray his trust and that because she's his wife that they have spousal privilege, which is just as rock solid as lawyer-client privilege. Of course, once this information is provided to Lalo, his demeanor completely switches here from sort of angry to sort of almost amused here. We're following him realizing that Kim is Saul's wife and that basically what happened here is that he did not come home last night from what he was doing for Lalo, and she got scared enough to come down and see him. He then realizes that he has the upper hand here. This is not a bad thing for him. If anything, this is a good thing for him, as he has more information now to maybe use against Saul should he ever want to. Of course, Kim then pressing Lalo here, telling him to tell her where he sent Saul. Lalo, of course, saying no. Very famously saying that he's like the cucaracha, the cockroach, a parable which I've used to discuss how Saul is sort of the cockroach who survived the nuclear blast of Gus Fring and Walter White's drug empire blowing up. basically saying that if he's alive, he'll show up in a few days. Of course, then following Lalo being very dismissive here, decides to end the conversation, knocking on the door saying done. Of course, Kim not receiving any information surrounding where her husband is, thus ending the scene in this episode. But yeah, like I said, this scene here, and I definitely even heard Vince Gilligan say this following this episode in the video of Inside episode 508, that you rarely see Kim Wexler make a very bad decision in the series of Better Call Saul. And at first glance, this scene right here seemed to be a very bad decision by Kim. At least that's what I thought at the time. But with the benefit of hindsight, having seen this entire season, at least in season 5, I really feel like the true consequences of this decision did not really affect Kim in season 5. But then again, theoretically, this decision could come back to haunt Kim maybe in season 6 of Better Call Saul. Then following this, the next scene in Act 4 then picks up with Mike and Saul waking up after camping out the night. We see Mike collect the water that he got from last night. We then see Saul proceed to urinate in the morning, as we all do. Of course, Mike telling Saul I wouldn't waste that, implying that he should save his urine to drink in a survivalist manner. That being said, in hindsight, I actually did some reading about this, and I feel like, again, I'm no expert here, but from the literature I read, apparently you're not supposed to do this, and that drinking urine can actually dehydrate you, and there's bacteria in it too. It's not completely sterile, contrary to popular belief. But anyway, that's not really important, I feel. I feel like the science in Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad is not completely on point all the time. I mean, even Mythbusters did an entire episode sort of debunking a lot of the scientific claims in Breaking Bad. And a lot of these sort of scientific claims were key literary vessels by which the plot was driven forward. But anyway, that's a discussion for a different video. So yeah, following Saul realizing he's going to have to save his urine because they don't have enough water for them both to survive out here, and if they don't have liquid, they're going to dehydrate and die. This is then followed by a long montage scene. Like I've said many times before, I love a good montage scene of Mike and Saul wandering through the desert. Again, an unbelievable scene here. I mean, so much going on here. Unbelievably well shot. Again, great to watch. I can only imagine what it took to film this scene and this episode to begin with. But yeah, over the course of this montage scene, we see them just trudging the long distance, the many, many miles back to civilization. We see the toll, the dehydration and the fatigue, and the having to drag around these 150 pounds for Saul takes on him, as well as Mike. We just see the physical fatigue grow over the course of this episode. That being said, I also think we see a quick shot of a tarantula here, a callback to Drew Sharp in the plot of Breaking Bad, of course, in the episode entitled Dead Freight it appears. Then, following the end of this montage scene, this is then preceded by a scene of Saul and Mike taking a break here due to the extreme fatigue. We then see Mike offer Saul a very small amount of water that he has as a means to help Saul survive. Of course, following Saul drinking this water, he then begs Mike for more. Mike saying no, they don't have enough for both of them, telling Saul if he wants more to drink his urine, of course, foreshadowing the end of this episode. Then following the extreme fatigue that Saul is clearly suffering from in this scene, we see him begin to drag the bags instead of picking them up. Mike telling him that's not going to work. But anyway, despite Mike's reservations, the extreme fatigue for Saul takes over, and we see him drag these bags in the desert. We then get a close-up shot of him dragging these bags, thus ending Act 4 in this episode. Then, following this, the fifth and final act in this episode then picks up again with Mike and Saul walking in the desert. We see them, of course, just being overcome by fatigue and dehydration. Then following this, we see Mike ask Saul if he's going to get that, pointing out that a $100 bill has escaped from the bag. Following Saul picking it up, he then realizes that there's money all over the desert because a hole has ripped in the bag from Saul dragging the bags on the ground. Following Saul picking up all of the money that's on the ground, he then, because he's not paying attention to where he's going, accidentally kicks a cactus plant, and we see him get a very deep puncture wound by one of the needles in these cacti. Of course, then following a scene of Saul pulling this needle out of his foot, this then proceeds Saul to absolutely break here, saying that he's done. He cannot go any further. He's so thirsty. He's so tired. He's basically going to give up here and die. Essentially, that's what he's saying to Mike. Mike telling him to get up, stop talking like that. You know, we have to keep going. Saul asking Mike, how are you still going? This then proceeds to display to us a very deep and impassioned scene by Mike Ehrmantraut here, saying he knows what it's for. Saul then asking him, what is it for? Again, I talked about this scene in more depth in a previous video, but we hear Mike say that he has people waiting for him, and his actions here in the desert are so they are taken care of. You know, despite the sort of illicit means by which he makes this money, he's saying his family will never know what he does. And as long as he provides for them, it doesn't matter if he lives or if he dies, because he knows when it's his time to go, he would have done everything he could do for them. Then following this speech, we see Mike spot the man who escaped from the shootout near their position, telling Saul that they're going to have to lay low here and wait it out. Then, following this speech, it appears that Saul had been inspired, let's say, by this speech and overcome maybe by just unbelievable dehydration and fatigue here, puts on a space blanket in order to attract himself to this driver and trudges out onto the main road, then telling Mike to get that thing ready, insinuating and implying to him that he's gonna set up a trap in order to shoot this driver and thus killing him and making them able to walk back on the main road, and thus terminating the one main problem they're having when trying to get back to Albuquerque. Of course, following Saul walking on the road, we see this driver attracted by Saul's space blanket. Of course, he drives right into the trap, and Mike ends up shooting him and killing him. We see a very dramatic scene of the car rolling over several times. Then following this, we see Mike proceed to check on the driver. It's displayed to Mike that he's clearly dead. Unfortunately, the gallon of water that he had with him was completely destroyed. Then, following all this drama, all this pain and suffering that Saul has gone through, we see him following a moment of introspection. Finally, at the end of this episode, take his water bottle filled with his own urine and proceed to drink it. A very symbolic sort of gesture here by Saul in this scene. Again, really sort of displaying to us maybe Saul coming to terms with his situation and who he is as a person now. You know, this scene, very powerful scene here of Saul drinking his own urine to survive. Then following this drink, we see them proceed to walk on the main road now that they can because this driver has been disabled. We then see, following them walking down the main road, we see Saul, of course, take off this space blanket and leave it behind him. And as they're walking down the road, we see this space blanket drift into the wilderness like a tumbleweed, thus ending this episode. Again, another bit of symbolism here, of course, you know, sort of displaying to us that Saul has finally come to terms with who he is and is maybe even so much as, you know, leaving the past of his brother Chuck behind him in that desert, symbolically displayed to us by that space blanket, like I said, thus ending this episode. So yeah, like I said, unbelievable episode here. My favorite episode of the season. I couldn't believe just how captivated I was by this episode of Mike and Saul in the wilderness here. Unbelievable suspense and drama. You know, 90% of the episode I feel takes place out in the desert, but there's just so much tension and so much suspense, and the dialogue that occurs in the scene is just unbelievably important to the character development of all of these characters in this series. I mean, the action with Kim visiting Lalo at MDC, again, a huge piece of foreshadowing, at least at the time it appeared, for where Kim's plot is going to go this season and will definitely go in season 6 of Better Call Saul. Again, so much symbolism here of Jimmy finally letting go of the past and his brother Chuck at the end of this episode. And at the same time, this episode left off on a huge cliffhanger here of what's going to happen between these two characters, of who made this call at the cartel safe house. So many questions that need to be answered in the next 2 episodes, which I can't wait to review prior to the review of season 6. So yeah, that's pretty much all I really got for you guys on this one. Like I said, a major thank you to everyone who watches and comments on my videos. I really appreciate it. Additionally, like I've said in the past, I apologize for not being able to respond to a lot of the comments lately, but I promise you I definitely read them. That being said, big shout out to the person who inspired my previous video. You know who you are. And as always, my name is Anton Jackson. Thank you again so much for watching this video.